So hello and welcome to another episode of Top Tens. I am your interim host, Karl Smallwood. Karl Smallwood. Yes, that is my real name. Let's move on to the title of today's video, 10 historical figures who received posthumous pardons. And something I like to point out in Top Ten's biographics and geographics videos, those latter two are our sister channels, check them out in the links below, is that a lot of people work on these videos. It's not just me. In fact, before I even lay my eyes on the script, at least half a dozen people's hands have already touched it. And the first person's hands to touch it are, of course, the author. And the author of today's script is Radu Alexander. Find links to their socials provided below, but let's get to it. A posthumous pardon is a form of symbolic redemption, a way of trying to right a historical wrong and redeem a reputation that has been tarnished for far too long. By definition, the person it is intended for is already dead, and that does prompt a discussion over the true merits of such a pardon. Some feel it is a waste of time and resources, that those people suck. Others believe it remains necessary, even if it's overdue, if only to, right that historical wrong and set the historical record straight. But we're not here to debate any of that. Instead, we are going to look at 10 famous cases where historical figures receive pardons decades, centuries, and in some cases, millennia after their deaths. Starting with number 10, Cicero. Back in 63 BC, a group of angry politicians, soldiers, and farmers led by Lucius Sergius Catilina, better known simply as Catiline, tried to stage a coup on the Roman Republic and overthrow, by force, the two ruling consuls, Cicero and Gaius Antonius Hybrida. Their plan didn't work. The Catiline conspiracy, as it was known, later exposed by Cicero, caused Catiline to flee Rome and be later defeated by Antonius at the Battle of Pistoria. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Cicero exposed several other co-conspirators and had them executed without trial. For 2,000 years, this has been a blemish on the record of the famed orator and statesman, who has been accused of murder after embellishing the threat to the state posed by the conspirators to advance his own career. But now, after all this time, Cicero has been cleared of any wrongdoing in a trial held at the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. Of course, this wasn't legit, but rather a mock trial organised by the charity Classics for All. Cicero's defence was provided by King's Counsel Ali Bourgeois, while the jury was comprised of 50 of his peers, all of them history buffs with degrees and the like. The barrister noted at the outset of the trial that the lengthy delay in bringing the case to court, always appreciate a bit of good British humour, he argued that the attempted coup brought the Roman Republic into a state of war, and that Cicero acted lawfully as a head of state during such a time by purging the government of enemies within who were guilty of treason, normally a capital offence. The jury voted in Cicero's favour by a vote of 28 to 22, and the Roman statesman was cleared of any and all charges. Of course, symbolically, but that's kind of what a posthumous pardon is. Number 9, Lenny Bruce. American comedian Lenny Bruce said a lot of things that upset and offended a lot of people, most of them really lame. Like the people he offended, not his jokes. He was pretty good. Like, he's in the show Marvelous Miss Maisel, which I watched, got really tired of, and then stuck with because I just really like Tony Shalhoub. I recommend watching it, if only for Tony Shalhoub. Eventually, this started getting him in trouble with the law, and he was arrested several times on obscenity charges during the 1960s. In all cases, he was either acquitted or had the charges dropped, but not in New York. After performing in April 1964 at Cafe A Go-Go, he was once again arrested for obscenity, and this time he was prosecuted and found guilty following a highly publicised 6-month-long trial. Bruce was released on bail during his appeal, but died of a drug overdose before it was decided on August 3rd, 1966. And for anyone unfamiliar with that time, obscenity charges could be brought against someone for simply saying swear words or referencing female genitalia, which is a key plot point in the show Marvelous Miss Maisel. Again, I recommend it for Tony Shalhoub. Almost 40 years later, Bruce was cleared of any wrongdoing when he received the first posthumous pardon in New York State history, courtesy of Governor George Pataki. The campaign was to clear the comedian's good and smutty name, was spearheaded by his daughter and ex-wife, multiple prominent First Amendment activists, as well as entertainers such as Robin Williams, Penn and Teller, and the Smothers Brothers. I feel like Robin Williams in his life just had enough goodwill to just get stuff like that done without any of the red tape. It's like, if I just got a letter, it's like Robin Williams is asking us to do something, it's like, is it Robin? Okay, yeah, cool. What does he want? It doesn't matter, it's Robin Williams. It's fine. He was the genie, and he was in Mrs. Doubtfire, and he was in all those other great movies. And yeah, let him do what he wants. Number 8. Henry Oian Flipper. Henry Oian Flipper made history in 1877 when he became the first black American to graduate from the United States Military Academy at West Point. He then earned a commission as a second lieutenant with the US Cavalry, joining one of the Buffalo Soldier regiments. After serving in the Apache Wars, Flipper was transferred to Fort Davis, where he became the new quartermaster. It's quite a career. During his time there, some money went missing from the safe, and Flipper was arrested and charged with embezzling. Keep in mind, this was still the point in history where you could just point at the black dude and blame them without any evidence. History sucks. A court-martial in 1881 found him innocent of the main charge, but guilty of a secondary one, which was deemed to be just as bad: conduct unbecoming of an officer. For this, Flipper received a dishonourable discharge in 1882, and ever since then there's always been talk that the actions that led to the lieutenant's dismissal were racially motivated. No shit. An army review conducted at a later date indicated pretty much the exact same thing. Again, no shit. Rumours suggest that Flipper might have even been set up by his commanding officer. I'm not going to say it a third time. It took a long time. Too long, but Flipper eventually found justice, at least in a symbolic sense. In 1976, the army exonerated him and changed his dismissal to an honourable discharge. Then, finally, in 1999, President Clinton gave him a full pardon and finally restored his good name. Number 7. Susan B. Anthony. So another president here, President Trump, also offered a full posthumous pardon to a person in a fairly similar situation. 19th century women's rights activist Susan B. Anthony, who campaigned tirelessly to grant women the right to vote. And for anyone unfamiliar with the history here, back in 1873, she was the defendant in a trial that caused a bit of a brouhaha in the country after being arrested for voting illegally in the 1872 presidential election. She wasn't the only one who did this. 14 other women from the same ward voted, but none of them had the high profile of Anthony, so the government didn't bother taking them to trial. The judge in this case, Supreme Court Justice Ward Hunt, already had an obvious negative view of women's suffrage. He didn't allow Anthony to speak until after the verdict and even directed the jury to find her guilty. The punishment wasn't severe, of course, simply a $100 fine, but Anthony still proudly announced in the courtroom that she would not pay a single thin cent, and she knew what she was doing. She wanted to take the case all the way to the Supreme Court. The judge knew this too, so he declared that Anthony would not be jailed for refusing to pay the fine, and the court took no further action. And a bit of extra information here about Susan B. Anthony is that initially they didn't want to charge her with any crime because she's a woman. It's like, oh, you know, she's just a silly... Like, I'm not saying this is the thought of the people back at the time. Like, oh, it's just a silly woman. Okay, go, off you go. And Susan B. Anthony's like, no, I want to be tried like a man, which is a fact I learned from the Powerpuff Girls. And then later, research went, oh, the Powerpuff Girls were completely right about this. That show is awesome. Moving on, number 6, Oscar Wilde. You know, speaking of awesome writers, nowadays Oscar Wilde is hailed as one of the greatest writers of the English language, but people did not always have such a positive opinion of him. In fact, following a highly publicised trial, Wilde was convicted of homosexual acts and did 2 years of hard labour that left him a weakened shell of his former self and brought on his death a short while later, at least according to some sources. This drama started quite unexpectedly, with Wilde serving as the accuser, not the defendant. You see, in 1895, the Marquis of Queensberry publicly denounced the playwright as a, and I quote, posing sodomite because he was having a secret liaison with the Marquis' son, Lord Alfred Douglas. Wilde decided to take him to court for criminal libel, but this turned out to be a kinda bad move because the nobleman produced evidence that he was telling the truth. The two were indeed knocking boots. The case against the Marquis was dropped and Wilde was then arrested for sodomy and gross indecency. He was found guilty and given the maximum sentence allowed at the time, 2 years of hard labour, which left him frail and sickly. After being released, Wilde moved to France and died of meningitis 3 years later, although what specifically caused the illness is still a matter of some debate. In 2017, Oscar Wilde and tens of thousands of other men in similar situations all received posthumous pardons after Turing's law went into effect, named, of course, after World War II codebreaker Alan Turing, but more on him later. I like doing these videos. These are interesting, important facts that I think people should know about. It's important to know that we're a more enlightened society in regards to our views on race and people's choices about loving and living the way that they want. But god damn, does it get depressing sometimes, because I record 3 or 4 of these in a day, and it just gets to a bit. It's like, the dude was gay. Who gives a shit? But then people give the biggest, most just undeservedly massive about it. It's like, why do you care? Number 5, Jack Johnson. In 1908, boxer Jack Johnson pissed off a lot of racist white people when he became the first black world heavyweight champion in history. He pissed them off even further in 1910 after winning a match dubbed the Fight of the Century. His opponent was James Jeffries, previously undefeated fighter who was billed as the Great White Hope, and he came out of retirement just to try and take the title away from the black boxer. When Johnson soundly defeated Jeffries, race riots erupted in at least half a dozen cities across the country. The city of Chicago got its chance to take its revenge on Johnson in 1912, only a few months after the boxer opened a swanky, desegregated nightclub named Café de Champion, as was his right as the champion. A white woman from Minneapolis complained to the police that her daughter, who worked at the club, was in a relationship with Johnson after he somehow abducted her. People tend to be attracted to people who are powerful and good looking. Who'd have thunk it? And a little bonus fact here that concerns this very fact is that Johnson was once just pulled over for speeding in a car with like a bunch of hot white ladies. The police officer was none too pleased about this and told Johnson, "I'm going to have to fine you for speeding," to which Johnson just casually produced a $100 bill. The officer said, "Well, the fine's $50," and said, "No, keep the change, I'm going the same speed on the way back." And then just drove away. Getting back to Chicago, the city council passed a resolution to revoke the club's liquor license. Music was prevented from playing on the premises, and Johnson wasn't even allowed in the building anymore. Still, the city wanted even more meat off that bone, so when another white woman admitted that she too had had an affair with a boxer and that the couple had travelled across state lines, they went for a drive, Johnson was arrested for violating the Mann Act, which pertained to white slave traffic. He went for a drive with a woman with whom he was sleeping with, who entered into an affair with him willingly. Okay. He was found guilty and fled to Europe before eventually returning and serving his sentence. There was no doubt that the targeting of the boxer was racially motivated. So after a passionate campaign spearheaded by actor and boxing enthusiast Sylvester Stallone, Jack Johnson received a full and complete pardon from President Trump in 2018. I'm just going to say it's really weird to see President Trump's name next to like these positive stories of, like, you know, abhorring the racism and sexism of the past. I'm just going to say that much. It's really, really weird to see his name juxtaposed to that. Number 4, Robert E. Lee. Oh, this is going to be a fun one in the comments. Following the Civil War, President Lincoln issued a general amnesty to the Confederate as long as they accepted the abolition of slavery and subscribed to an oath henceforth to faithfully support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and Union of the States thereunder. There were a few exceptions, though, including officers who held and resigned Army and Navy commissions in order to join the South. They could still receive clemency, they just needed to apply directly. General Robert E. Lee, the man who led the Confederate Army, was among these people. He accepted the oath and filed the petition, but somehow the paperwork just slipped through the cracks. Secretary of State William Seward sometimes gets the blame, and supposedly as a final screw you to Lee, he received his petition and gave it to a friend as a souvenir, while instructing his underlings to lose the oath somewhere in State Department records. A few years later, Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, issued a second amnesty which removed those exceptions, but for whatever reason, Lee never followed up his petition and he died in 1870, technically a stateless person. Fast forward an entire century when, thankfully, people don't really care about the Confederacy anymore. I'm going to get some shit for that one. And an archivist going through old records found the general's long-lost oath inside the National Archive. After 5 more years of tedious bureaucracy, we are talking about the American government here, President Gerald Ford signed the congressional resolution on August 5th, 1975, which granted Robert E. Lee a pardon and restored full American citizenship. Number 3, the Groveland Four. A particularly dark chapter in Florida's history, which is saying a lot given Florida's history, was the Groveland Four case in 1949. For anyone unfamiliar with it, just be warned, this is some pretty dark and heavy subject matter. Viewer discretion is advised. In 1949, 4 black teenagers stood accused of raping a white woman and assaulting her husband in Groveland, Lake County, Florida. One of them, Ernest Thomas, went on the run and was caught by an angry mob and shot over 400 times. Another one, Samuel Shepard, was killed by a sheriff after claiming that he tried to escape. The other two, Walter Irvin and Charles Greenlee, confessed after being tortured and were both found guilty and sent to prison. Irvin was paroled in 1968 and was found dead in his car just a year later, while Greenlee became the only one to put the whole ordeal behind them. He was paroled in 1962 and moved to Tennessee with his family, passing away in 2012. Even during the 1950s, the Supreme Court ruled that the four men did not receive anywhere close to a fair trial. By the time the second trial came around, only two of them were still alive, and even if they were represented by future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, they were still found guilty by an all-white jury. It wasn't until half a century later that the state of Florida recognized the grave injustice done to the men. In 2019, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, I'm reading that correctly, yes, issued a posthumous pardon to the Groveland Four, and 2 years later, a judge exonerated them of all charges. Again, it's just very weird seeing that man's name next to, something positive. Anyway, number 2, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great faced a similar trial to the aforementioned Cicero, and by similar, I mean identical. The same kind of mock trial organised by the same charity, Classics for All, in just a different year. As before, the trial took place at the UK Supreme Court, where the Macedonian king stood accused of war crimes during the burning of Persepolis. His defence was provided by King's Counsel Patrick Gibbs, while King's Counsel Felipe Sands served as prosecutor, and Lord Legate, Justice of the Supreme Court, presided over the whole thing. There was no debate over whether Alexander was responsible for the city's destruction or not. It happened. We know he was responsible for it, it was just a matter of the motivation behind why he did it. The prosecution claimed that it was a deliberate political act, while the defence argued it was merely a tragedy resulting from drunken behaviour. We've all been there, it's unfortunate, sure, but was it a war crime? Well, in the end, the mighty conqueror walked out of the courtroom a free man, having been acquitted on all 4 counts of war crimes, and thank God for that, because otherwise, the good name of Alexander the Great may have been sullied forever. It's literally in his The Great. Anyway, number 1, Alan Turing. Alan Turing was an English mathematician, computer scientist, and crypto analyst. He was one of the pioneers of artificial intelligence and computer science, and as a codebreaker was instrumental during World War II by helping the Allies crack coded messages from the Axis powers. And nowadays, there are like a bajillion things named after him. He regularly features among the first in polls of the greatest Britons who've ever lived, and is even on the £50 note, which I would love to show people. But like all people under 40 in the UK, I don't carry cash. I only have some Christmas money I got to show what our money looks like. In his own time, Turing wasn't as appreciated for one reason. He was gay. In 1952, he was charged with gross indecency and pled guilty. To avoid prison, he accepted a hormonal treatment to reduce his libido, a process we now call chemical castration. Less than 2 years later, Turing committed suicide by cyanide poisoning, although some believe his death may have been accidental. And in 2009, the British government issued an apology for how Turing was treated, with Prime Minister of the time, Gordon Brown, writing that he deserved so much better. Still, it wasn't a pardon. In fact, a pardon was actually denied by then Justice Minister Lord McNally, reasoning that Turing was correctly convicted based on the laws of the time. Maybe the laws were wrong. Eventually, the Queen herself, old Liz, she stepped in and used a special exception known as the royal prerogative of mercy to grant a pardon to the computer scientist, which is just something the Queen could do. And you know it's bad when the monarch has to step in and be like, really? I have to use this power that I never use because you messed up that bad. Not only that, but in 2016, the UK passed the Alan Turing Law, which granted retroactive pardons to all the men who've been convicted for homosexual acts in the past, including the aforementioned Oscar Wilde. And it's like, oh my God, it took that long. Anyway, people found this video to be informative, educational, and I can't even say it, just, if you like the video for whatever reason, like in this case means you just found it, educational, informative, perhaps entertaining, perhaps my frustration and pain at having to talk about this stuff is entertaining to you. In that case, like the video, comment, feedback, suggestions, yell at me for not knowing enough about American history, even though I'm reading a well-researched article created by Radu Alexander. And as I always like to say, go out there and have the day that you deserve. Cheers, everybody.